Let me introduce who's on the stage. Right over there is Erik Nordkamp, who is General Manager UK and Cluster Lead Europe, Australia and New Zealand, and Upjohn, a Pfizer division. Have I got that right? Yep. Yes. And formerly Managing Director of Pfizer UK, as well as former ABPI President. Next to him is Niall, who you all know, of course. Then there is Louise Houson, Managing Director UK and Ireland for MSD, and here is Rob Webster, Chief Executive for the South West Yorkshire Partnership. So this is a discussion really around why the pharmaceutical industry and the NHS collaborate and don't collaborate, what the barriers are, and we have about 40 minutes. I'm going to start with you, Niall, and I just want to ask you, why was there a need for this report?
Well, I think there's been a long-standing view that the life sciences industry and the NHS have not historically maximised the potential on either side for that relationship. So that's something that we've had for a long time. I think the why now is, first of all, that within the NHS itself, the whole notion of partnership and how the NHS behaves as an organisation is undergoing a fundamental look and, I hope, a fundamental transformation. So this is also about the relationship the NHS has with local government, what it has with the community and voluntary sector, how it reaches out to independent sector providers, both in social care and in health. So I think there's something about the health service at a moment looking out at where useful partnerships should come. Historically, I think if I was ultra critical, I would say that parts of the NHS have viewed any kind of deal, particularly with the private sector, as am I going to win and are they going to lose, or is it going to be the other way around, rather than seeing the potential of win-win. I think that attitude is changing. I think that leaders now absolutely recognise that there are opportunities for partnership where both sides are able to win. So that's a sort of peculiar NHS bit. The other bit is, frankly, and we hear it quite a lot from the Secretary of State about tech, we have had the life sciences strategy and the sector deals which have come from that. There is an absolute recognition, I think, across society as a whole of a number of things. One is that for UK PLC, the life sciences are absolutely critical for all our prosperity. This is not a narrow thing, it's a wide thing. The second thing is that the life sciences strategy makes it absolutely clear that that is true, but it is also true that the life sciences will not thrive as much as they should unless the NHS becomes a much closer partnership. So there is an absolute requirement, I think, now for the health service to look at this and to see the potential. And the last bit is just on the win-win bit, in terms of giving faster access of patients to medicines, of attracting researchers and of building our research base. We have a very strong life sciences sector and we have some amazing research within the NHS. But we can do more, and we can do more quickly, and we can scale up. And I think using the Academic Health Science Network, using those organisations to help us scale up some of the work that's already been doing is going to be a part of this.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask Louise and Erik both to answer the same question. But Niall was talking there about things are changing now. You've got to grasp the net, as it were. But do you think things are changing? Can you see rapid progress? Can you see an opportunity right now? Or do you think it's not happening as rapidly as it could?
So, I think there's some really great examples of where it's happening in small areas across the NHS and where there's been some fantastic partnerships delivered. And I think there's some great examples of that in the report across a wide range of therapeutic areas. I do think now is the opportunity to try and scale that for the benefit of everybody, because ultimately the beneficiary of a really effective partnership is patients, and that all of the programs that we should do should be centred around improving patient outcomes. And so there is a win-win for everybody in that. I think the other thing is it's just a huge emergence of new medical innovations, whether that's technology or, frankly, pharmaceutical innovations that require changes in the way that care is delivered. And that will only really be successful if everybody works together. I think what there is now is a recognition that this is one holistic environment in the UK, and that everybody's success is reliant on working across the ecosystem.
Is that the crux of the change? This recognition?
I think so. I think so, and that was very clearly articulated in the Life Sciences Industrial Strategy. So yes, for me.
Erik, I mean, there is a degree of cynicism from those of us who are outside it looking in to say that you see innovation in pockets, as Louise described it. And there are some excellent examples in this report, but it never spreads. There isn't the wider conversation that gets it across the NHS, and that always seems to be a block.
Yes, I mean, that is true, and obviously the main reason for that is the fragmentation of the health system in terms of the choices that were made when the system was set up, that healthcare is best delivered locally by people that know locally how it should be done and how it should be tailored to the situation. But every advantage has its disadvantage. The disadvantage of that is that you get the not invented here syndrome, and it's more difficult to copy that. The other component, though, that is important to mention, in addition to what Niall and Louise have said, is that there is now a recognition as well that you need capacity to think through how you're going to bring this wave of transformative innovation, not only medicine, by the way, medical, digital, into the health system to actually transform care and produce the productivity that we need to tackle the rising costs of health. And at the same time then deliver the better outcomes and the better experience that often comes with that. And I think there's now a recognition, both with industry and with the health system and with the government probably, that we need to create the space to collaborate, to think that through collectively, both with projects that we do and collaborations that we do in the health system itself, but also in preparation for new technologies coming. And that's why, for example, the Accelerated Access Collaborative expanded scope is so important, where now everybody's recognized that there's now a vehicle that allows us to do that. So we now both have the possibility to do the projects in the health system collaboratively, but also do them ahead of time and identify where the barriers are to make this happen.
Well, it's a marvellously optimistic beginning to our conversation. Rob, how much space do you have as a chief executive for innovation?
So just to explain that I've got two roles. So I've run an NHS trust, and I also lead the West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership. So we're an integrated care system which has an expenditure of £5.8 billion and looks after 2.6 million people. And we're very much in this space, I would say. The way that we look at this is that clearly we need to deal with the health inequalities that people face. We need to tackle the care variation that persists, and we need to manage with the resources that we've collectively got between the NHS, councils, universities and others. If we look at that, there's three lenses we can look through. The first is service. So how do we join services up so they better meet the needs of people in the 21st century? The second is innovation. What do we need to improve to meet those needs? Care's too episodic, care's too fragmented, care's too based on paper. How do we make sure that the psychotropic drugs that people are taking are going to be as effective as possible? And then the third lens we can look through is the one of industry. 22% of medtech jobs in the UK are in the Leeds City region. So there's a space here, there's a sweet spot here where we could say we can fundamentally improve the care that we deliver and the service through that lens. We can innovate and we can improve the economy. We can significantly improve the economy, and having a job is something that will help drive health improvement. So it's a virtuous circle. The space that I have comes from having a well-functioning academic health science network, a local academic health partnership with the universities where we can bring everything together to have one conversation with the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry or the health industry, and it's something that we need to drive. Creating some protection and I would say optimism, hope, and incentives around that space is pretty important.
Just to go back on that slightly, I mean, Amanda Doyle was talking this morning about the need for data sharing, for better communication between the CCGs, the community services and so on, and she said they came up against this issue where they were doing virtual, Skype consultations, and the care homes didn't have powerful enough Wi-Fi. So it's those little things that for chief executives like you, and also you've got to look at your bottom line. You're saying to somebody, in 3 years' time, I'd like this innovation to be in place, but you've got to get enough staff. You've got to stop using bank staff. All of those tensions.
Yeah, so nobody's pretending that we're not being asked to, drive the car and change the wheel at the same time, because we are. But the flip side of that is, if you want to inspire staff, if you want to tap into the creativity of the people who work for you, this is a great way to do it. Our organisations are full of world experts in something, or people with a great deal of hope and ambition and insight. If we tap into that, we can say, yes, we know things are tough. There are ways we can make it better. Let's work with industry to get the research, the capacity. Let's work with the universities. Let's make sure that we can get some insight into what the future looks like. Because half the time, I think our staff run on hope.
Louise, just to come back to you, one of the interesting issues that's raised in this report is about trust of pharma, and why you would get into bed with them. How big a barrier is that?
I think it's a very real barrier, and I think this is why communication is so important, and working with those parts of the NHS where trust already exists, doing some great work, and then sharing that broadly. And I think trust takes a long time to build and also disappears very quickly. But I think it's really important that trust is fostered at the very highest levels of all the organisations. So for me, it's a leadership challenge as much as it is anything else. And that strong sponsorship from the top, strong leadership around the benefits of collaboration, along with some really good local change agents who also believe and can encourage their colleagues to do that, is what's needed. And I think sharing and celebrating those brilliant successes, but also not being afraid to say when projects haven't worked, identifying why not, and taking those learnings and also sharing those as well. But trust is critical in every single effective working relationship is built on trust. And so I think the question is, how do you quickly build that at a local level? Because trust is built between people, not community. So it's individual trust, and I think that's where giving people the time to have those conversations is going to be really important.
You're nodding there, Neil. You see this?
Yes, I do. And I think, again, of course, if you look at the NHS, you can always use any adjective to describe it because it's so vast. So there obviously are people who have who work very effectively with pharma. There are also people who regard pharma as the devil incarnate. So, but I think there is real potential to build a new set of relationships, and that partly comes from, and I'm not sure this has quite come out yet, I think that the industry itself looks at the NHS in a slightly different way. And of course it's always used research and has built research around it, but of course one branch of industry has basically been about selling pills to people, and I think that the sophistication in the way in which they see following patient care pathways, understanding where their products fit in with those pathways and so forth, is much more sophisticated than it was. And in order for them to succeed, they need to work much more closely with the healthcare system. So I think, again, there are just enough of those sweet spots, to use Rob's words. I think there are enough of those sweet spots around for us actually to be able to take this forward. And the test of this will be to look in 5 years' time and say, well, has that relationship fundamentally changed? And are we seeing the relatively small number, I suppose you could say, of really successful projects? We're seeing that starting to fill up the map.
Erik, there's a paragraph in here that talks about permission. So sometimes it was felt that cross-sector partnership needs to happen under the radar, and that NHS leaders could be reluctant to celebrate and communicate success. That is what's happening? This is what's coming across?
Well, I mean, my own experience has been that over the last 2 or 3 years, there have actually been numerous examples where collaboration exists. In fact, in preparation of a discussion with senior management in the NHS, we did an inventory of all the collaborations we had at the ABPI and the NHS, and there were about 70 that we had inventorized, and we didn't even know there were this many. And many of them did fantastic work with fantastic outcomes. Some of them are mentioned in the report. And increasingly, people from the NHS came to us because they're looking for solutions for their productivity problems. And very often, anybody that brings a solution to that, and often we are one of those that can bring a solution, is welcome. But what is missing from that is then publicly acknowledging that we're collaborating, actually celebrating the success, and seeing how that could be scaled up. And this is really where I think everything needs to slot in place. I mean, Louise and Neil were already mentioning it. It often starts with leadership. You know, leadership needs to absolutely, from the front, from the platform, say that they are behind this and actually show that on a daily basis and spend time doing it. And at the same time, then that needs to then permeate through the organization. You need to talk about it regularly. You need a lot of examples, because the moment you have a critical mass of examples that is showing that this is actually good for both parties, you start to create momentum. And momentum is important in this case. And I actually feel that the momentum is coming. It's gathering. And I think we're getting there.
I mean, just before I bring Rob in, what do you think has stopped pharma from doing that? The innovation from your perspective. So you yourself say you were surprised at just how much was out there, how great the collaboration had been that you hadn't communicated, which was the very point that Louise had brought up. What had stopped you communicating it?
Well, I think, you know, as an industry, we need to also look in the mirror, right, and say, why did we do these projects? And it was often a one-off. We were not ambitious enough. We didn't go in as an industry to say, okay, this project, our mission is actually to scale this across the whole of the NHS. And often, when you want to scale it, you have to think, when you start the project, how would this be scaled in order for it to be successful and for it to be possible to scale it. So that is, I think, one element. The other element is that as an industry, I think we're used to getting the products ready to be used by patients, but then we pull our hands away. And I think increasingly, as an industry, we have to look in the mirror and say, what we really need to do is actually say, how can these products potentially change the way that healthcare is delivered? And how can we help the health system to make sure that they get the full value out of that? And I think this is something that we're learning as an industry, and we're getting better at. So we're also on a journey.
Rob, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just this point about leadership. I think, just to give you a concrete example, in the integrated care system of West Yorkshire and Harrogate, all of the leaders have signed up to working together in a certain way. So it doesn't matter if you're a council chief exec, a political leader in a council, NHS chief executive, or university vice chancellor. Collectively, we've said in a deal with the Association of British Healthcare Industries that we will bring leadership, advocacy, support, information, access to innovation. And what you will bring is something similar. And we want to do exactly the same thing with the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry, because we know that we can garner significant improvements in the way that the care is delivered in the future. We're already seeing some of that in the kind of projects that we've heard about. So in Leeds, we're looking at protein markers, working with a US company. By working with all of the Leeds-based healthcare organisations and the system, everybody's looking at, is this trial effective, and what are the downstream consequences for care? So if people have different interventions, then they will have different outcomes, but they'll also need a different intervention subsequently. So by working on that collectively, we get the system to work from the start. And that's a different conversation. So scaling that up so that we improve the options for all of our futures feels like a really good thing to me.
I think, Louise, I was just going to ask you, I think there are sometimes people the public perhaps doesn't quite understand what we mean by the life sciences industries, that it's such a diverse area in a way. So here we've talked about drug companies, but of course it's far greater than that. Is it again, just coming back to this idea of communication, do you think it's misunderstood? And it also goes with this idea of that sort of dirty money, you know, drug companies and these private companies, they just want to make money at the expense of the NHS rather than for the good of the NHS.
So I think it's a really good point. I think this sector as a whole is not broadly understood, and the value that the life sciences industry broadly adds to the UK economy is massively underrated, and the impact that we have on the health of the British UK population. And so I think that's true. For me, it comes down to transparency, though. So where we are working together, that it's very open to everybody in why everybody's investing in this project. So why would Company X be involved in this project? Why are they supporting it? And then there's, you know, I think sometimes people think we're trying to hide something, whereas if we're very open and saying this is why we're supporting it, because we believe that either we can improve, you know, variation in care, or we can improve the outcomes of patients with this condition. I think being more transparent is the key to all of it, to build trust with those people that we're working with, but also to improve, I suppose, trust across the broader sector as well.
I'll remember that for the phone call I have to make tomorrow to a drug company asking why they're charging so much for their drug. Are there any questions? Yes, here we're going to have to take back one of these microphones, so now you're going to have to be collaborative.
Thank you. The UK at the moment, as a result of a lot of work, has got probably the most highly organised clinical sciences arrangements in Europe. We have the NIHR, we have the BRCs, we have the Health Regulatory Authority, all of whom in many respects work effectively, and the rest of Europe does not have that. It's completely chaotic, if I speak to my colleagues in Europe. How can we maximise the undoubtedly effective system we have at the moment for regulating and encouraging science in the life sciences sector?
That's a big question. Who would like to take that?
Well, I mean, I do. One of the tragedies of our current debate about how we leave Europe has certainly been the idea of ending all cooperation between the different research bodies. Now, of course, the answer is in lots of clinical specialties, they will go on cooperating, and irrespective of whatever happens. But we do face, MHRA was seen as being the lead regulator in Europe, and of course it's now dropped out of the European, or it will drop out of the European Medicines Agency, which of course had its home in London and has had to move. So I think there's certainly something about how do we, if we have Brexit, how do we construct a set of relationships going forward? And I hope that going forward, the EMA and the European authorities will be more open than they are at the moment. I think they're feeling bruised by that process, and we absolutely want to maximise cooperation. There's still very fundamental questions about us being rule takers as opposed to being rule makers in the new system. There are some really quite thorny issues that still have to be sorted out. But at the end of the day, the fact is research is not what I suspect many in the public think it is, which is somebody staring into a little dish in a lab and going eureka, because it doesn't work like that. Most of this stuff is all built with cooperation between different research teams in different parts of the world. At the moment, we attract people from all over the world to come and work here. And that is a big challenge going forward, because the size of our market is likely to be obviously smaller because we won't be part of the European market. I don't want to be, I'm not going to be a counsel of despair here. I think it is a real challenge. I think we have massive strengths in our institutions and our research and in the industry we have here. So whatever happens going forward, we want to maximise cooperation. I think maximise cooperation with Europe, even if we're outside it. And we absolutely need to make sure that we're an attractive place for researchers and others to come. Because our our success research-wise is not necessarily people who are born and brought up in Huddersfield or wherever. I mean, they are there too, but we absolutely attract people from all over the world, and we absolutely need to keep on doing that.
Well, I like to think that the level of debate here is better than the level of debate last night. So we will, Eric, don't let me down.
Let me add one thing to that. And I think one of the things I always said when I came to the UK a couple of years ago is that we need to move away from a very transactional relationship that we have between the various institutions. You know, transactional relationship between government and industry, transactional relationship between the NHS and industry, exchanging positions, exchanging messages. Now, if you look and you extrapolate that into what's going on in the world right now, we have to reimagine the way we partner in all sense, in all corners. So that means that at the moment, when you look at the life science industrial strategy, the real advantage at the moment that we've declared is that we've got a very strong science base here in the UK. But you can actually build on that and make sure that you create a real ecosystem, an end-to-end ecosystem, where with all these transformative technologies that are coming through, that you're saying, okay, but we need to not only invent them, we need to now say, how are we going to value and assess them in the new world? How are you going to value and assess a gene therapy? There's going to be a cure, but it's going to be used over 10 years. How are you going to deal with antimicrobial resistance, for example? How are you going to deal with digital technologies, and how are you going to value them? And how are you going to then use them in the health system and let them transform care? Now, whichever country can come up with an end-to-end system that can show all of that will have a huge competitive advantage. And given the fact that we're losing as the UK some advantages that Neil was referring to in terms of the MHRA, for example's position, we need to now create other advantages as a country. And that is one major one, because you look at where we are in the UK, we don't only have a really good science base, we've got the most renowned HTA agency in the world and the most renowned health service in the world. Now, the key is now combining all of them and making them end-to-end.
Rob, you wanted to say something?
So I think I was going to make 2 points. You just really made one of them beautifully, I think, which is you've got to create the right infrastructure that's connected. You know, you might have a set of institutions and infrastructure over here around research, which is good, but for years it didn't want to do anything about comorbidities, which is the biggest issue that affects the NHS today. So we've got to connect that to the rest of the infrastructure. So the ecosystem is one thing. So I always think you've got to have that structure right. But the second point I would make is it's about culture. And we've got to invest in the relationships. So I would really want to see, standing alongside me, if I'm going to be standing in public, saying this is a priority for us in terms of investment, in terms of time, in terms of capacity, and I'm stood next to people from the industry, from research and elsewhere, who are public faces that people know that they trust and that I trust. And I think that's about those relationship building pieces, which are going to be just as important as the infrastructure.
Did you want to add to that? I mean,
I think I just agree with the points that are made, but I think the life sciences industrial strategy in particular sets out how we can build and capitalise on the assets that the UK has and create a really flourishing industry here for the benefit of patients. And I think it sets it out really nicely. There's already been 2 sector deals resulting from that, with commitments involving both the industry and the NHS and the government, as well as other third-party organisations as well. So I think we've got everything in place. I think we just need to see it deliver now.
Just while you've got the microphone, I mean, I was just to give a specific example, and I was looking at something that MSD has been doing with diabetes, which comes down to this idea of comorbidities. Perhaps you could explain what you were doing in Buckinghamshire, I think it was.
Yes, there's 2 elements to that. So the first one, and really looking to improve outcomes for diabetic patients in Buckinghamshire, and a transfer of the complex patient from secondary care into primary care. So one piece of that was really supporting the local GPs understand their own data better, understand their patients, pulling out through the GP systems the differences in care that were being received, and looking at which patients were getting the best outcomes and supporting them from a change management perspective. So really using data to inform better outcomes. The second one was supporting then patients in care homes and making sure that the staff there understood the risks associated with diabetes and were able to take better care of some of those complications that could result in them going back into hospital. So treating them to understand complications of diabetic foot, allowing them time to get training on how to manage a hypo to reduce then the number of ambulance visits into care homes. So a lot of it was around training and a lot of it was around data as well to support the locality.
Yes, there's a question here.
Hi,
And another one over there.
on the point on relationships, I think this event and report is actually a real step change in terms of building pharmaceuticals' relationship with the NHS. But traditionally, and certainly this year, there's always proportionately very few pharma delegates at the NHS conference. I'm sure they'd love more. So my point being, what can industry do to encourage employees to look more outwards towards the whole system as opposed to often going to pharma-only events and talking amongst themselves? I make a generalisation to make a point, but I'm interested to see what you'd say.
Well, what do you think, Neil?
No, I think it's fair. I think it's
I mean, I can answer
You're
that.
inviting them.
Yeah. I mean, I can answer that in part. I mean, the first one is that over half of our employee base are out with customers every day in the field, really understanding the issues of the NHS at a local level and developing local relationships. So I think that's what the vast majority of my employees do on a daily basis. I think coming to conferences like this adds additional value and to build relationships and build networks. And I think the very fact that we're sat here today jointly on stage discussing some of these issues is a great example of where we are trying to make that difference. Of course, for any company, the better you know your customers, the better you're able to respond to their needs. And I think that's something that the industry is really embracing right now.
I think one of the things that we need to do is to cross-pollinate more. So let me give you an example. So I was invited to become a non-executive director on a major trust in London. And initially when I was asked to do that, I was saying, why would you want me to do that? I'm from the pharmaceutical industry. Don't you see a conflict of interest? And they said, no, we want your experience in transformation, in change management, in organizational change, And so I said yes. And I have to say that apart from us benefiting from each other's expertise, I learned so much about what the NHS is about, what it is not, what I thought it was, and how we can come together and collaborate better, because I personally understand the NHS much better. And one of the things I realized when I speak to some of my counterparts in other companies is that they didn't necessarily have that same experience and knowledge. And we need to do more to understand each other better, really. And it means also that we as an industry need to invite probably some people from the NHS into our organizations so that we just understand each other better. And in the end, it's about people talking to people and building relationships. And that can only happen when you spend time together and discuss the issues that you have. On the other hand, on sort of more project basis, I've also personally started some collaborations with some people where we said, let's just put your vision for your organization together with our vision for your organization just to get to know each other. And you know what? They're not too dissimilar. So in the end, it comes down to how do you really set up a world-class organization and run it in a world-class way. And we can learn a lot from each other. And because we're both working in the healthcare space, that will be very beneficial.
But for a long time, there have been frustrations with industry about the way the NHS moves, and it's very glacial pace at times, and frustration for you and finding out where decision making happens and how it can be moved forward. I mean, did that surprise you? Did it drive you insane?
Gentlemen,
I was going to say.
the main stage session will commence in 15 minutes.
Neil, you're wanted.
Well, I would be lying if I would say that there was a lot of governance, that I had to deal with. But that has good things and bad things, right? So a lot of governance is required because we're dealing with patients' health. So we're dealing something very serious. On the other hand, they can also slow you down. So it's always a balance with these things. So I think it comes back to the same point: getting to know each other, benefit from each other's experience, and how you can improve.
When I worked for a medical charity for many years, we had no
Can you
difficulty.
just put your microphone slightly closer? Thank you.
When I worked for a medical charity for 30 years, we had no difficulty working with the pharma industry. We had to become streetwise. We had to agree contracts at the outset and make sure both sides stuck to those. And I've seen clinical cardiologists individual clinical cardiologists work very effectively with pharma. But when I moved into public health, I saw a situation where public health consultants were not prepared to work with the pharma industry.
Ideologically.
They just had an anathema about it. They had a fear. And how do we get a situation where we can build up their skills and their confidence and maybe get them permission and guidance from government as to how they can interact with industry? Because I think it is a tragedy that they don't.
Do you think, Rob, that there is a permission that needs to come from somewhere that isn't quite there at the moment, or does it come back to this moment, we've already got that permission, just got to build on it?
I think often people use this idea of permission as an excuse because they don't really want to do something. I was just having this conversation in a previous session, and really it comes down to this moment where I think a point Erik made earlier about leadership. So I think the tone is set from the senior leaders.
Where do the leaders come from? Good leaders who can do this. Are they all in place, or do we need more?
Of course, it's a mixed ability class, and I'm sure I'm not anywhere in the place I want to be in that class either. But we are seeing the emergence of, as the Confed report showed, of a series of leaders who want to operate in systems, not just run institutions, and who look out, not up, for the work that they need to do, out to the populations, out to their customers, out to their people and their partners. And I think if you've got a system like mine that's saying, if you want to be successful here, this is part of the deal, because services will change, innovation will be in place, and the economy will be better, I think you can make a really compelling argument that it becomes more difficult to ignore.
Are there any questions here? I just wanted to pick up on one thing that the previous questioner was asking is about governance, perhaps. And it seems to me that governance is a particularly difficult issue in this way, as you were talking about. Louise, you have to have the highest possible standards because you're dealing with the NHS and because you're dealing with, obviously, with patients. Is the industry there? Can they do it?
Absolutely, and I think, the industry has very clear guidelines about how we can work with the NHS, how to work with the NHS, and has very strict governance around that. And every individual organisation will have their own processes and checks and balances to make sure that we do that effectively. So again, I think it's an excuse. I think doing things in the right way is absolutely the most important thing. But I think if you get the right idea with the right people to deliver the right outcomes, then the governance, whilst necessary, should not prevent that work from happening.
Niall, I just want to ask you, sorry, Erik, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to say that governance is using the rules that you have, right? And I think one of the things that we need to really say here as well is that when it comes to collaboration with industry, whether it's early in R&D or later on, there are a few things that need to be in place. First of all, the rules as to how you collaborate, and when it's acceptable and how you do it. But then also incentives have to be in place for the organizations to actually be willing and able to do it. And then the resources have to be made available. That's all part of governance and how you manage that. So governance is more than just the rules. There have to be other things that have to be in place as well to deliver all of that. And we said leadership, and so governance is a lot of things. We think it's just a rules framework, but it's more than that.
Did you want to say one last thing before we wrap up? Did you find this whole thing optimistic? Are you're thinking there's a bright future ahead?
Well, I think the potential is there. I don't know how fast this scalability issue is very significant. I think there are different attitudes, and you've heard a lot of them within industry, and I think Rob epitomizes, I have to say, the cutting edge of where the health service is at, but it's also the direction in which we're going. So the opportunity, frankly, is there, and we need now to grasp it. And I agree. I think the governance, that sort of issue about somehow farmers going to, I don't know, steal this, or they're going to put people on first-class planes flying, that world has gone, and I think we have to recognise that world has gone. It is much more tightly governed. And actually, we need, in some ways, we need to be much more open. And we've got a bit obsessed about data and privacy and so on. Anonymised data, most patients, when they're asked, when they're participating in clinical trials, say yes, absolutely. So we need to get this into balance, and we need to, of course, people are frightened about their own private data and some of the issues going forward. The only final point I would make is, this is all great, people are starting to come together and so on. We will hit bumps on this road, so there will be occasions when a pharma company does something that the NHS doesn't like, and we have to have that discussion. But we have to have it in a more mature way, which identifies the individual issue, without then saying, oh, well, that's it, we can't build these series of relationships. Because we can do that, and it comes down to what all of us, I think, have said, which is about trust and relationships.
Well, a fantastic discussion about collaboration, perhaps a bright future. And I hope you've taken away a lot of messages from this, and I do think the report is really worth reading. But can you just thank our panel for their time, and thank you.